Imagine stepping off a crowded transport ship in the summer of 1943, the smell of salt water still clinging to your uniform, your boots hitting solid American soil for the very first time. But you're not a tourist, not an immigrant searching for opportunity. You are a prisoner, one of Hitler's soldiers dragged across the ocean in chains. And in your head you've already written the script of what comes next: brutality, starvation, maybe even death. Because that's what you've been told to expect. Americans, they're monsters, at least according to the propaganda fed to you back in Germany. But when the gates of the Camp Creek open, what greets you is something very different. Barbed wire fences stretch in neat squares under the hot sun. Guard towers loom overhead. Rows of wooden barracks stand in rigid formation like silent soldiers. It looks like the setting of every nightmare you imagined. Only it's not. Inside, you're handed fresh clothes, not rags. A bed with clean sheets, not straw. Hot meals with real meat, not watery broth. And then this is the part no one can believe: there's soccer on the weekends, musical performances at night, and even a camp cinema where the flicker of Hollywood films dances across white sheets stretched tight as screens. It feels wrong. It feels suspicious. Why would the enemy treat you this way? This is the story of the American prisoner of war camps during World War II, places that shocked not just the men who lived behind the fences, but the world itself. Because within these camps, enemies became teammates, strangers became neighbors, and sometimes captors became almost like friends. The first weeks were the hardest. Hundreds of men poured through the gates every day, still wearing the dust of distant battlefields on their uniforms. Their faces hollow from endless marches, their eyes sharp with suspicion. They marched into the camps braced for cruelty. Instead, they found routine, order, even kindness. Still, the air was thick with tension. Guards eyed the prisoners carefully, fingers resting on triggers. Prisoners whispered among themselves, wondering when the trap would be sprung. Was it all some kind of trick? One evening, a group of German soldiers refused to eat the food served to them. They thought it was poisoned. Why else would the enemy give us beef stew, bread, even coffee? One muttered under his breath. For hours, the tray sat untouched steam, curling upward until it vanished into the night air. Finally, one man, starving, trembling, picked up his spoon. He took a bite, then another. And then, like dominoes falling, the rest followed. The stew wasn't poisoned, it was just stew. And that was the first crack in the wall of suspicion. But it wasn't just food that caught the prisoners off guard. It was freedom, or at least a strange kind of freedom, inside the fences. During the day, prisoners were assigned work details, repairing roads, chopping wood-building barns. And for this, they earned small wages credits they could spend at the camp canteen. Imagine the shock: enemy soldiers, men who had been trying to kill Americans just months earlier, now standing in line to buy cigarettes, candy bars, even shaving cream from American shelves. At night, the camps came alive in ways no one expected. Some prisoners formed orchestras with instruments provided by the Red Cross. Violins, trumpets, drums, music that floated across the barracks like a memory of home. Others wrote plays and staged performances, acting out comedies that made both prisoners and guards laugh until their sides hurt. And then there were the movies. Hollywood's biggest films projected onto makeshift screens with prisoners sitting shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by the silver glow. For a few hours, war disappeared. They weren't enemies. They were just men watching the same story unfold, their laughter and gasps rising together into the night. Still not everyone trusted this strange kindness. Some prisoners believed the Americans were softening them, trying to break their loyalty to the fatherland. "Don't be fooled," one whispered in the barracks. "This is a trap. They want us to forget who we are." But others started to wonder. If this was a trap, it was a convincing one. And slowly, the camp became more than just a prison. It became a community. Men planted gardens between the barracks, growing tomatoes and cucumbers in neat rows. They painted murals on the wooden walls, colorful scenes of German villages, castles, and rivers. In some camps, they even built little chapels, their voices rising in hymns that echoed beyond the fences. The Americans allowed it all, because in truth they had their own strategy at work. By treating their prisoners with dignity, they hoped to win something far more valuable than obedience. They wanted trust, cooperation, maybe even a quiet form of loyalty. And it worked at least most of the time. But not every camp was peaceful. Beneath the surface there was still anger, still loyalty to Hitler, still the fear that one wrong move could unravel everything. One night in a camp in the American South, guards were jolted awake by the sound of shouting. A fight had broken out between prisoners. Fists flew, boots stomped. Men tumbled across the dirt floor of the barracks. When the dust settled, it became clear what had happened. A group of loyal Nazis had attacked their fellow prisoners, accusing them of being too friendly with the Americans. It was a reminder, sharp, violent, that no matter how kind the captors were, still lived in the hearts of the men behind the fences. And as the months turned into years, the camps would continue to reveal a side of war that almost no one had expected, a story, not of hatred, but of humanity. This was just the beginning. Because what happened next inside those barbed wire fences would blur the line between enemy and ally in ways the world would never forget. As the months passed, something remarkable unfolded behind the barbed wire fences. What began as suspicion and silence began to transform into something else, something nobody on either side of the Atlantic would have predicted. The prisoners, once hollow-eyed and defiant, began to adapt. Some even began to thrive. For the first time in years, they were safe from bullets, bombs, and the endless march of war. Life inside the camp, while confined, carried a strange sense of stability. But here's where it gets interesting. That stability created cracks. Cracks in loyalty, cracks in ideology, cracks that revealed just how human these enemies really were. And with that said, one of the most striking changes came through sports. Every weekend, camps organized soccer matches. Picture this: hundreds of prisoners lining the edges of a makeshift field, cheering wildly as two teams, both wearing tattered uniforms stitched from scraps, clashed in the southern sun. Guards stood watch nearby, but even they couldn't help shouting when a ball soared toward the net. And it wasn't just soccer. Baseball, that quintessential American pastime, made its way inside the fences. At first, the Germans laughed at the strange bats and gloves. But soon they were swinging at pitches, running bases. By 1944, the war was raging harder than ever in Europe. But inside the American homeland, another kind of battle was unfolding, one of labor, survival, and perception. The United States faced a massive shortage of manpower. With millions of young American men overseas fighting, farms and factories back home were desperate for workers. Fields lay unharvested fruit, rotted on the vines, and entire industries threatened to grind to a halt. The solution: put the prisoners to work. It was a decision that shocked many Americans. After all, these men were the enemy. They had fired bullets at American soldiers, sunk American ships, and cheered for Hitler. And now, they would be trusted to work side by side with ordinary citizens. But the government pressed forward, driven by necessity. And soon, German prisoners began stepping beyond the fences of their camps, under guard at first, then sometimes, shockingly, with barely any supervision at all. Pranks. One of the first major tests happened in the farmlands of the Midwest. Prisoners were bussed out to fields of corn, wheat, cotton, their boots crunching through soil that stretched farther than anything they had seen in Europe. Farmers at first stood stiffly at a distance, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Could they really hand over their harvests, their livelihoods, to enemy soldiers? But necessity has a way of erasing hesitation. The Germans worked hard. Many of them had grown up farming themselves, and they knew the rhythm of the soil. Within days, they proved their worth, working sunrise to sunset, filling baskets and wagons with crops that otherwise would have gone to waste. And something unexpected began to happen. farmers and prisoners talked. At first, only a few words gestures broke an English awkward laughter. But over time, conversations deepened. They spoke about families, weather, even shared recipes. In one Iowa town, a farmer's wife secretly baked bread for the German work crew, slipping loaves into their lunch sacks. They were just boys, she later said. No different from our own. Oh, of course not every American welcomed the sight. Some towns erupted in anger. Why should the enemy eat better than our soldiers? Read one headline. Mothers with sons overseas spat on the ground as prisoner trucks rolled past. Yet over time, the anger softened. Because what people saw in front of them wasn't propaganda posters of bloodthirsty Nazis. It was tired, skinny young men who laughed at bad jokes, worked hard for their meals, and politely tipped their hats when passing women on the road. And for the prisoners, the experience was just as transformative. Many had been told America was cruel, poor, and full of hatred. But what they saw was wealth, abundance, and ordinary kindness. Fields bursting with crops, stores stocked with goods, families who smiled at strangers. For men raised in the wreckage of Nazi Germany, it was like stepping into another world. There are countless stories of friendships unlikely, fragile, but real. In Texas, a group of German prisoners helped rebuild a farmer's barn after a tornado ripped through the county. When the job was finished, the farmers shook each of their hands. "You've done more for me than my neighbors," he admitted. In Minnesota, a prisoner named Carl struck up a friendship with a 10-year-old boy whose father was overseas. Carl taught the boy how to whittle wood, carving small animals with his pocket knife. Years later, the boy would recall, "He was supposed to be the enemy, but to me, he was just my friend." And perhaps the most remarkable part, some prisoners were even allowed to walk freely into town, escorted only by trust. They bought ice cream at local shops, strolled through libraries, even attended church services. Imagine the scene: a German soldier once sworn to Hitler, sitting quietly in an American pew, bowing his head in prayer beside the very people who once feared him. But trust came with risks. There were escape attempts, though fewer than anyone expected. Some prisoners slipped away into the woods trying to reach Mexico or Canada. But many of these escapes ended not with violence, but with surrender. Prisoners often gave themselves up within days, starving lost, or even returning voluntarily because life inside the camps had been better. One famous case tells of a prisoner who escaped in Louisiana only to reappear at the farm where he had been working. "I just wanted to see if you'd let me stay on," he told the farmer sheepishly. The farmer, stunned, allowed him to finish out the harvest season. Still beneath the smiles and handshakes, a quiet unease lingered. For the Americans, it was the question of loyalty. Could kindness soften an enemy's heart, or was it simply feeding the enemy's strength? For the prisoners, it was guilt. Every loaf of bread shared, every laugh exchanged, was a reminder of betrayal to the fatherland. Some never let go of their hatred. They worked the fields in silence, glaring at the soil, refusing to engage. For them, America's generosity was nothing but a trick, a velvet glove over an iron fist. But for many others, the experience planted seeds that would never be forgotten. Decades later, historians would look back on this strange chapter of the war and realize something profound: America hadn't just captured prisoners. It had captured minds. By letting their enemies walk their streets, eat at their tables, and share in their daily lives, Americans had waged a quieter kind of war, a war of perception of humanity. And in many ways, they had won. Because when the war finally ended, and those German soldiers were sent back across the ocean, they carried with them not just memories of fences and guard towers, but memories of kindness in unlikely places. A farmer's handshake, a child's laughter, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. But this story isn't over, because the end of the war brought new questions, new conflicts, and new challenges. What would happen when these men, once enemies now changed by their time in America, returned home to a shattered Germany? And how would their memories of life behind the wire reshape the way they saw both their homeland and their former captors? The war was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed in fire and rubble. And suddenly, the thousands of German prisoners scattered across America were no longer enemies of the state. They were simply men awaiting the long, uncertain journey back home. But for many of them, home was not what they remembered. The first wave of repatriations began in late 1945. Trains pulled into camps, their cars filling with men who had spent years behind American fences. As they boarded, emotions clashed inside them, relief at leaving captivity, dread of what awaited across the Atlantic. On the voyage back, conversations hummed in every corner of the ships. What would Germany look like? Would their families still be alive? Would they even recognize their hometowns? The answers came quickly, and they were brutal. When the ships reached Europe, the returning POWs stepped into a wasteland. Cities once vibrant with music and laughter were nothing but skeletal ruins. Streets they had walked as boys were now piles of broken stone and twisted steel. In Cologne, churches that had stood for centuries were gutted. In Berlin, entire neighborhoods were flattened, burned to ash. And then there was hunger. True gnawing hunger that clawed at the stomach day and night. Germany was starving. Food lines stretched for blocks, and even a crust of bread was precious. For the men who had just left American camps where meals were hot, beds were clean, and soccer games filled the weekends, the shock was overwhelming. One prisoner later wrote, "We had expected America to be cruel and our homeland to be strong. Instead, America was generous and Germany was broken." But returning prisoners carried more than just memories. They carried a new perspective. They had seen abundance, fairness, and freedom in the very country they were told to hate. And when they compared it to the rubble and hunger of post-war Germany, many quietly asked themselves, had we been lied to all along? This question rippled across the returning POW population. Not all embraced it, some clung desperately to the ideology of the fatherland, even in ruins. But for thousands of others, the seeds planted in America began to sprout. They had sung in orchestras, acted in plays, worked side by side with American farmers, and been treated shockingly with dignity. These experiences didn't vanish when the fences opened. They shaped how many ex-POWs rebuilt their lives. Historians would later call this the silent education of German prisoners. Unlike re-education programs run by the Allies, which pushed democratic ideals through lectures and pamphlets, America's POW camps taught through experience. By living decently, even as captives, these men had witnessed another way of life. One prisoner recalled standing in line at a camp canteen holding a candy bar he had bought with wages earned from chopping wood. He looked around and thought, "In Germany, I was a soldier. Here I am, treated as a man." That memory stayed with him long after he returned home. Another wrote about working on a farm in Texas where the farmer shook his hand every evening after a day's work. "He had no reason to thank me," the man said, "and yet he did. That handshake was my first lesson in democracy." Watched? Of course not everyone welcomed the returnees. Back in Germany, suspicion and bitterness ran deep. Some civilians saw the former POWs as spoiled for having lived comfortably while their families starved under Allied bombing. Others accused them of being Americanized, their loyalty to Germany diluted. It was not uncommon for men to hide their stories of camp life, fearing judgment from neighbors who had endured far harsher conditions in concentration camps, slave labor, or the front lines. And yet beneath the silence, the memories lingered. As Germany began to rebuild in the late 1940s and 1950s, the quiet influence of these former POWs began to emerge. Many of them became teachers, businessmen, even politicians. They carried with them a subtle appreciation for fairness, cooperation, and democracy, values they had glimpsed behind American fences. In interviews decades later, countless men admitted that their time in America had reshaped their outlook. One summed it up simply: "The Americans won us not with guns, but with decency." But perhaps the most powerful proof of this transformation came years after the war, when former prisoners returned voluntarily, not as captives, but as visitors. In the 1960s and 70s, ex-POWs traveled back to the small towns and farms where they had once labored. They knocked on doors, carrying photographs and broken English, searching for the families who had once shown them kindness. And more often than not, those doors opened wide. Hugs were exchanged. Tears shed, meals shared, once again this time as friends, not enemies. The story of German POWs in America is one of the strangest contradictions of World War II. In a time of global hatred and destruction, in a nation preparing daily for battle, enemy soldiers were treated with a level of humanity that defied expectations. They were fed, entertained, even trusted. And in the end, those choices rippled far beyond the barbed wire. They shaped men's lives, altered their beliefs, and perhaps, just perhaps, helped lay tiny foundations for reconciliation in the post-war world. Because sometimes the most powerful victories are not won on battlefields. They are won in the quiet moments in a soccer game, shared a loaf of bread, offered a handshake across enemy lines. That is the legacy of America's prisoner of war camps, a reminder that even in the darkest of wars, humanity can survive.